Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, and welcome. My name is Julia Joja. I'm a senior fellow of the Frontier Europe Initiative here with the Middle East Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event on Nagorno-Karabakh called Fragile Peace, 1 year anniversary of conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. MEI's Frontier Europe initiative explores interactions between Middle East countries and their Frontier Europe neighbors, the parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, which form a frontier between Western Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. The program examines the growing trade, energy, security, and political relationships with the aim of developing greater understanding of the interplay between these strategically important regions. And after nearly 3 decades of minimal confrontation, violent conflict erupted in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia in September 2020. In November, a fragile peace declaration between the two countries brokered by Russia was signed, with Azerbaijan gaining swaths of territory in the contested land following thousands of military and civilian casualties and a threat to stability in the South Caucasus. However, the renewed tensions leave peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia in flux. These are some of the issues that we're going to be discussing today, including questions related to what is the current state of security threats and regional stability. How have Russia's peacekeeping efforts evolved a year after the conflict? What lessons can we learn from the 2020 conflict? I am honored to be joined today by three distinguished panelists. We have today joining us Paul Goebel, former US Department of State expert on non-Russians in the former Soviet Union; Robert Hamilton, a non-resident scholar with Frontier Europe Initiative; and Mamuka Tsereteli, also a non-resident scholar with Frontier Europe and a senior fellow with the Central Asia Caucasus Institute. To read their full bios of our distinguished panelists today, please visit MEI's website. I also look forward to taking audience questions through our Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu or tweeting us at MEI. If you have technical issues, again, please email events@mei.edu, and please feel free to ask your questions at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking at all of your questions and will factor in as many as possible. With this introduction, let's get going on our discussion. We have a lot of ground to cover in terms of what has happened a year ago, what the context for that is, and how we're looking at Nagorno-Karabakh today in terms of peace negotiations and normalization on the ground. I would like to start the discussion today with a broad overview, looking back 1 year and contextualizing that with the region in terms of history. A while ago, I was asked in a private discussion to sum up Nagorno-Karabakh, the conflict in 2020, in just a few minutes. It was a difficult challenge. Now I want to return the challenge back to Paul today and ask him if he can give us an overview of the conflict a year ago and how we can contextualize that in a regional context. Paul, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to speak on this issue, and especially to do so at the Middle East Institute. I say that for two reasons. First, the discussion of the Karabakh conflict tends to come north-south. It tends to come from looking from Moscow south rather than from the larger world south-north. And that has two consequences. The first is it tends to make people think that whatever is going on should be best understood by what has gone on in the last week, 6 weeks, a month, or a year. People who study the Middle East are very much aware that the past is a much longer thing, that in fact Faulkner's observation that the past isn't over, the past isn't even the past, it's still there. And to understand what is going on in Karabakh today and the talks about it, it's necessary to know a little bit about what has been happening there, not just in the last 30 years, but in the last 200. The South Caucasus has been an area of extraordinary complexity with respect to Azerbaijan, what is now Azerbaijan and Armenia. 150 years ago, the cities were largely Armenian and the rural population was Azerbaijani Turkic. What we have watched over the 20th century is the sorting out of those people, some of this by natural force, economic forces, some by political design, with the idea of creating proto-nation states. That led to displacement of populations, to deaths, to conflicts, and it led to the construction of borders by the Soviet government that were intended to create and institutionalize conflict between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. It is not true that Armenians and Azerbaijanis have always been at loggerheads. It is not the case that they have a conflict in which the Armenians and Azerbaijanis did not live together. If you visit Baku today, you will discover that in the center of the city is an Armenian church because that was an Armenian place not that long ago. And so the structuring of nation state competition that the Soviets engaged in from the 1920s on created the situation. It created a situation in which certain asymmetries, which I'll return to later, were institutionalized, leading to not only to conflict on the ground, but more importantly, to the conflict of national elites who were drawn from marginal territories rather than the core territories of their ethnic group. What we may have seen last year with the Azerbaijani advance is the end of that process. And that gives a great deal of optimism for the future. For the very first time in over 100 years, the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia are not drawn almost exclusively from people who come from the marginalized territories. Nationalism, as people should remember, almost inevitably happens where they're at the margins, not in the core country. And it is precisely the way in which the Soviets structured the geography and the political divisions of Armenia and Azerbaijan that you had something reversed. In other words, the Soviets created a situation in which the Armenian and Azerbaijani leaderships were drawn, and this was especially true in the last 40 years, almost exclusively from people who were going to be the most nationalistic, not the least, and therefore the least willing to reach some kind of settlement. With the Azerbaijani advance last year, the 44 days of military action, and this is only the last stage of a military conflict that's been going on since 1988. We have a situation in which in Armenia, we have a leadership that is not dominated as it had been by Armenians from Karabakh or with the connection to Karabakh. And in Azerbaijan, while it is still true that the president of the country traces his origins back to Nakhichevan. And again, I'm going to talk about that in my second talk. But rather, you have more people who come from the core of these two communities. Precisely because that is the case, we may be seeing a reversal of what was structured into the nation building in the 20th century. And therefore, there is a real possibility that we could have peace. The problem is going to be that the other imbalances that exist between the two countries and the role of outside powers, including Iran, Turkey, and Russia, all of which we'll be talking about later, may make that the emergence of that opportunity stillborn. That remains to be seen, but there is more reason for optimism, it seems to me now, that we may actually have a long time settlement rather than a ceasefire that will be broken again, as happened a year ago.
Thank you, Paul, for this broad overview, which kind of sets the stage for the region that we're talking about right now, but also for the larger Eurasian region and how we can understand conflicts around Eurasia. Let me turn to Bob to look again 1 year back and offer us a perspective in terms of the military, how the conflict has been resparked a year ago, and what the military outcomes are for the region, for Nagorno-Karabakh, for Azerbaijan, for Armenia, and for the Caucasus overall.
Sure. So thank you, Yuli, and thank you to the Middle East Institute for this invitation to talk about something that I think I'm sitting here in the South Caucasus in Tbilisi. And so, this conflict clearly matters to Armenia and Azerbaijan, but as Mamuka knows, it matters to the Georgians as well, because it had the potential to destabilize the entire region, a region that is already sort of always teetering on the edge of stability, in which outside powers are always prone to sort of interfere in a destabilizing way. But so I'll look at the military outcome of the conflict. Of course, was a clear Azerbaijani victory and the regaining of much of the territory that it lost in the 1988 to 1994 war. I think there's three major reasons for that. One, everyone has talked about a lot, and that is the impact of drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. My sense is the drones and precision artillery impact was decisive in the conflict, but will not be revolutionary in conflict more generally. And the reason is, in all conflict, in all warfare, you have offense-defense balances, right? When there are times in warfare when the defense is ascendant, and then there are times when the offense is ascendant. And so we have a period here where drones have allowed the offense to be ascendant. There's not a really good, right now, countermeasure for drones. The US and other countries are working on them, but nobody has something that's as effective as the drone is, as the UAVs are at destroying things on the ground. So when this war started, both sides did have drones. Often Armenia's drones get overlooked. Armenia had domestically produced drones, but they were much fewer in number and much less capable than the Azerbaijani imported drones that were bought, the TB2 from Turkey and the Harap from Israel. And both had ballistic missiles and rocket artillery of similar range and accuracy, but Azerbaijan had much more. And the Armenians ended up having to limit the use of their artillery because of the threat from the drones. In other words, as soon as they set up to fire, they were at risk of being killed by drones. Azerbaijan's drones were very effective against Armenian tanks, personnel carriers, tracked artillery, air defense artillery. They also used them to attack deep in the Armenian rear areas, to cut off reserves, Armenian reinforcements from the front line. Armenia's mostly Soviet-era air defense systems were ineffective at targeting Azeri drones. The drones flew in general too high and were too small for them to see. And so they just were never able during the course of the conflict. The Azeris did lose some drones, but a small number based on how many drone missions they flew. There are effective counter-drone systems appearing on the market now. Some are kinetic interceptors, some are electronic jammers. There are even drone-killing drones that countries are experimenting with. But for now, the drone has the upper hand, and this conflict really showed it. And so until these systems, these counter-drone systems, are fielded in adequate numbers, things like on the ground, like tanks and armored personnel carriers, artillery and air defense systems will remain vulnerable. So that would be the first lesson I would draw. The second is it's not all about technology. The quality of the force and the will to fight still matter. So war, as the US Army is fond of saying, is still a human endeavor, right? It's still fought by people. We're not at the stage of a war of the machines yet. The quality of the force matters. There was an interesting Russian analysis of casualty figures from the war, and it found that although both sides had high casualties among the 17 to 19-year-old age demographic, The Azeris had relatively more casualties in the 25 to 27 demographic, whereas the Armenian force was described as young and old. So mostly young conscripts led by old Soviet-era leaders. The Azeri force had a stratum, at least based on the casualty figures, of fairly experienced middle-grade soldiers. The other thing is the Armenian military was not fully engaged in the conflict. Most of the fighting was done by conscripts and reservists from the Artsakh army, from the Karabakh army, the Armenian Karabakh army. The Armenian armed forces were not fully committed to the fight that the way the Azeri armed forces were. Azerbaijan had been single-minded in pursuit of the goal of reversing its loss in the 88 to 94 war. They had outspent the Armenians many times over in the intervening couple of decades. One of the reasons possibly that Armenia was deterred from engaging sort of more robustly in the war was the deployment of some Turkish F-16s to Azerbaijan that probably were sent to act as a deterrent to the Armenians using some of their more advanced aircraft. So the Su-30s, Armenia had just taken delivery of 8 Su-30s from Russia. They never flew in the war. And one reason for that may be that they were aware that there were Turkish F-16s that were on the ground in Azerbaijan that were meant to deter Armenia from escalating. So yes, Azerbaijan outspent Armenia. Yes, Azerbaijan was more committed to reversing its loss in the early war. I'd say it's not all about the money. The systems that were decisive in this war, mostly the drones, are much cheaper than a lot of the systems that they destroyed, right? A Turkish TB2 drone, which was the most advanced drone the Armenians used, costs $1 to $2 million. The things that they were destroying, the tanks, Su-30 batteries, S-300 batteries cost in the range of $6 million to $100 million. So the calculus, the math, the economic math was much on the side of the Azerbaijanis and the drones. The final point I would draw is maybe I would call this fighting the last war. It's not unusual for countries that win to fight the last war because and the Armenians clearly won the war of 88 to 94. But the way they postured to fight this war was sort of a repeat of that war. Whereas the losers, the Azeris, were very much motivated to fight a new type of war. So the Armenians were dug in along what they were calling the Bagramian line, which is a sort of line of fixed defensive fortifications along the border between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan that hadn't really changed much. They hadn't changed at all in terms of location since the end of the war in 94. So the Azerbaijanis had 2 decades plus to pinpoint these locations. Azerbaijani drones and artillery made quick work of them as the war started, pinpointed Armenian air defense assets for destruction. Then they used drones to attack deep, to attack the reserves and to attack the reinforcement routes from the reserves to the front line. And what that essentially did was left the Armenian forces on the Bagramian line exposed, vulnerable, and attrited by artillery before the Azeris even attacked with maneuver forces and with sort of close combat forces. So the Azerbaijanis really fought a 21st century war, and the Armenians, I think, in many ways fought the last war, the war that they had won. Even in mountainous terrain, which a lot of Nagorno-Karabakh is, which is theoretically easier to defend, Armenian forces were defeated because their lines of supply were constrained by the terrain. It was very easy for the Azeris to pinpoint exactly where the lines of supply and reinforcements were, to send drones or precision artillery to destroy the reinforcements, and then also to destroy the lines of supply, destroy roads and bridges, which again left the Armenian forces in the mountains sort of cut off from resupply and vulnerable to direct attack from the Azerbaijani forces. And I would leave it there and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Bob, for this overview and lessons learned from the Karabakh War. I think what we can draw from that is that military equipment does matter a lot in the economy too, financial investments, but that it's still a matter also of politics, of motivation, and of the human factor factor. And I think that weighs into our lessons learned from Nagorno-Karabakh too, and for the region as well. Let me move in time a little bit on to the peace negotiations and what they have meant over the last year for both Armenia and Azerbaijan, but also for regional powers and regional countries in the Caucasus. Mamuka, can you offer us a brief overview in terms of these peace negotiations, a sum up of how they have been running, and how we can assess progress in peace negotiations on Nagorno-Karabakh?
Thank you, Julia. Thanks for inviting. And I think thanks for this timely event. Thanks to Frontier Initiative at Middle East Institute. Let me start briefly about let's establish the facts that and new realities that were created after the war a year ago, because I think it's essential for us to understand where each actor participating directly or indirectly in this conflict stand at this stage after and found themselves after the conflict. First of all, definitely, clearly, Azerbaijan is a major, both militarily as well as politically, winner of this conflict. And when Paul mentioned earlier that looking from south to north, it's definitely important prism to look at this. And Azerbaijan strengthened its strategic position, definitely with our south, but also in a sense with our north, but most importantly with our east and west as well. It strengthened its strategic position, to summarize it briefly. I think obviously Armenia is losing party, both strategically as well as from political and geopolitical perspective. So that's a fact. And I think we are moving to the new status quo in the region, but I don't think that we are there yet, because many developments, including these transportation links, border delimitation, other issues are still under discussion. I'm sure Paul later will touch on those issues. But one positive outcome of recent development is that I think parties under trilateral umbrella of negotiation between Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russia are coming closer to border delimitation and some other issues, transportation, kind of linkage restoration, kind of maps and directions, and so forth. But I would like to come back to this maybe a little later and continue some facts on the ground after the conflict. Obviously, Turkey increased its presence in the region, and that's important kind of geopolitical outcome of this conflict as well. Now, looking at Russia, there's a lot of discussion whether Russia is winner of this situation after the conflict, or is it loser, or is it not? It hasn't changed its position much. I think it's important from a Russian perspective that the fact that Russia is back to the region, meaning back to Azerbaijan, with its peacekeepers, and we have some negative experience of Russian peacekeepers in other parts of South Caucasus. But Russia is back in a role of peacekeeper, in a role of arbiter, and pretty much in a role of de facto ruler of Armenian-controlled territories of Karabakh. So this is a new role of Russia, and Russia is also controlling some of the communication lines in the region. So I personally don't think that Russia lost its strategic position in Azerbaijan and South Caucasus. And that was the compromise that Azerbaijan had to make in order to make the gains that Azerbaijan did during the conflict. I think it's interesting fact as well is that when I look, and I think we talked about that last year when we discussed this conflict, that it's interesting fact that with a great power constant, in this case, Turkey and Russia, small actors, or we will see in this case Azerbaijan, can achieve their national objectives with military means more efficiently than with diplomatic means. And in a sense, Russia, by maintaining neutrality in this conflict, during the conflict period, obtained some leverage over Azerbaijan, but did not lose any leverage, or maybe even get stronger vis-a-vis Armenia as well. So I think that's important kind of consideration. Now, that leads us to other factors and other outcomes and other kind of observations. Where is West in this picture? And unfortunately, there's no Western institutions. They were not seen either during the conflict or after the conflict, or they are not seen proactively participating in the process now. So I think it's the outcome of the conflict and the way it was developing, it's major diplomatic and otherwise strategic failure of the West in many ways. I think that leads us to, obviously there's one more actor we need to talk about, this is Georgia. Georgia is obviously was concerned because of the large community of Armenians and Azerbaijanis living in Georgia. So outcome, first of all, during the process of conflict and after the conflict, maintain peace inside of Georgia was very, very important. But Georgia is trying to play now more proactive, conciliatory, convening role in a conflict. And there was a couple of occasions already. Georgia facilitated some negotiations, and minor progress was made in exchange of prisoners, and some maps were transferred to mine maps of the Karabakh. Some of the parts of Karabakh and surrounding areas were transferred to Azerbaijani side. So there was some positive role Georgia is playing. There was a concern that Georgia may be losing party as well because of the rearrangement of the transit routes that may bypass Georgia. I think my personal view on this is that on energy side, this is not really the expected development, at least for next decade or so, because it's a large investment, they are already made and so forth. So this is more about maybe railway and highway developments, but even there, it's in general, more trade, more transit through the region should benefit everyone. And Georgia's role will be maintained as long as Georgia takes proactive position in working with its partners in Central Asia and Europe and so forth. And Georgia is looking at more proactive participation in Three Seas Initiative and some other initiatives that connects different European countries, but also connects Europe to Middle East and Central Asia. And one last point I would like to touch, Julia, with your permission, is now role of the OSCE, and it touches a little bit of Georgia's position as well. You know, in absence of any security platform that somehow mediates between party, I'm talking about international platform. If you look at what's going on in last decade, or maybe more than decade, Russia managed to really diminish role of OSCE, and if you recall, there was an agreement called Conventional Forces in Europe, and that was supposed to limit forces and their allocations, both equipment as well as troops allocations in different parts of the frontier areas of between Western and Eastern blocs and so forth. So in a sense, even in a broader sense, Helsinki commitments that even Soviet Union was part is no longer in place. That process is dead or almost dead, and somehow we ignore it and we don't want to admit it. And there's no effort to revitalize it. And in a sense, we are following reactively to what is going on in terms of security picture in this region, not just in South Caucasus, but in the broader neighborhood of Russia. And we don't have any proactive position. When I say we, mean everybody outside of Russia. Anyways, I'll stop here and maybe we'll have more discussions later.
Thank you, Mamuka. I'd love to draw back to in a few minutes to how you see energy transport and others in the region as a follow-up to the peace negotiations. But you made a very interesting and I think relevant point apropos the West. So let me turn the discussion back to Paul and ask him from his perspective. You know, many have been criticizing the role of the West, the United States, as well as the EU in the Caucasus, in the context of the Nagorno-Karabakh II conflict, as being absent, as new borders being drawn in the absence of the West. And as we're talking now, I think the current term is strategic competition. As we're talking about strategic competition worldwide, but also in this region, how do you assess the position of the United States and of the West overall, of the EU as well, in the Caucasus, in the context of these peace negotiations? Is the West losing its foothold in the region to the detriment of regional powers, particularly Russia and Turkey? And what does that mean then, if that's the case, for the region in terms of how it views from the inside, how it views the role of the West in the larger region? Paul?
Thank you. There's no question that the West was not present. I can only agree with both of the previous speakers. We weren't there, and we haven't been. I would also like to make a broader point, however, about that. This is a conflict, and there are more such conflicts, where the people who are the direct participants are no longer the objects only of outside powers. Armenia is not simply an agent of Moscow. Azerbaijan is not simply an agent of Turkey. But rather these are actors in their own right. There's a tendency to talk about fracture zones only in terms of what the outside powers are doing, and not to focus on the increasing role of the direct participants. What happened and what is happening in the South Caucasus has much less to do with outsiders, and that includes Russia and Iran. I want to come back to that. But let me address these issues by doing three different things and making 3 points under each. First, I think we have to understand, why did the war end when it did? Azerbaijan could have occupied all of Karabakh. There's no question. They were in Shusha. They could have taken Stepanakert. They could have occupied the area. Why did they stop? Well, the conventional wisdom is, well, the Russians were going to intervene. I don't think so. I think there was another reason. The first is, the primary reason is, had Azerbaijan done that, it would have gotten a black eye internationally. It would have precipitated a massive refugee flow. It would have looked as if it was going for everything, and there would have been very little possibility for talks, and there would have been more willingness on the part of a variety of actors internationally to come in support of Armenia, to protect Armenians. That's a reality. The role was, how would the West react? How would Russia react if Azerbaijan went further? But it went very far indeed. It took all of the buffer zone away from Armenia. It took 2/3 of Karabakh itself away from Armenia. It now controls the water supply going into most of Karabakh. It is in a position to dictate terms. The fact that the Russians are there with a 5-year remit probably means less than people in Moscow and Washington think. The real players are the local players. And I want to suggest, it is always that there are 3 asymmetries in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan that we need to keep our eye on. The first is the asymmetry of economics. Azerbaijan simply is going to get wealthier and wealthier relative to Armenia. Over time, it's going to dictate terms. Whether people like that or not, this is the way it's going to be. That was obvious 30 years ago. No one wanted to admit it because people were still thinking then, as many are still thinking now, What will Russia do? What will the Americans do? What will the Europeans do? What will Turkey do? What will Iran do? But in fact, it is precisely the growth of the Azerbaijani economy which has allowed it to determine outcomes. And the Armenian economy isn't there. If there's going to be a corridor built, and I'll come back to this, if there's a corridor built, the Azerbaijanis can pay for it. The Armenians can't. And because they can't, they have to get outside support, either from Iran or from Russia or from somewhere else. So the first asymmetry that matters is economic. Azerbaijan is bigger and is going to get progressively bigger. That is going to drive politics here, not whether there are 1,500 or 2,000 Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh. Simply, it's going. I don't trust the Russians either. I think they'll stay longer than 5 years, but I don't think they are going to drive politics because I think the Azerbaijanis are in a position to. The second asymmetry is an asymmetry I alluded to in my introductory remarks, and that is that Nakhchivan, the non-contiguous part of Azerbaijan, is separated between Azerbaijan and by Armenian territory. Karabakh, which is an Armenian population, never had that status of being an autonomy that belonged to Armenia, and that disjunction, that contrast, meant there was always going to be tension, and it was magnified by the third asymmetry, which I also alluded to, that the political elites of Armenia for the last 40 years have come exclusively from people who made their careers in Karabakh. That's no longer true with Pashinyan. His government consists of people who did not make their careers rising out of the Karabakh experience. They are much less nationalistic, at least less nationalistic in the same sense as the Karabakh Armenians than was the case until 2 or 3 years ago. The second, on the other hand, in Azerbaijan, the situation is the asymmetry of politics in Baku is that while the Aliyevs are known as the Khans of Nakhchivan because of the birth of the father of the current president, the current government of Azerbaijan is vastly less Nakhchivan centric. It's vastly more Turkic centric. That's a different thing. Being interested in the links to Turkey is a different thing than being driven by your nationalist agenda in terms of Nakhchivan. The second situation where there are three factors are corridors. We are being told now that at the upcoming meeting, trilateral meeting, there will be an agreement, there will be a timetable for the opening of corridors. If that's so, Azerbaijan's biggest victory will not be the retaking of territory that Armenia controlled, but rather gaining direct access to Nakhchivan from Azerbaijan proper. People in the West, people in Moscow, routinely forget that an Azerbaijani who wants to travel from Baku to Nakhchivan still has to go through Iranian territory, still has to get an Iranian visa. That is a permanent irritant. If there is a corridor, and by that I don't necessarily mean transfer of sovereignty, but if there is a corridor, that will change, and that will change the dynamic of what Azerbaijanis expect. It will make it possible to make concessions on the issue of Armenian status that were not thinkable until now. The second corridor, of course, is the corridor between Armenia and Iran. We haven't mentioned much about Iran. One of the reasons I was glad to see MEI get involved in this is that Iran is fundamentally important. If Armenia is going to make progress, it is going to have to link south. And that means the corridor through the Syunik Oblast of Armenia has to be developed. Tehran has committed itself to the development of that corridor. It will cross the corridor that Azerbaijan is probably going to get between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan. How that corridor is developed what the role of Iran is in developing it, because Armenia can't afford to pay for it, and won't be anytime soon, will drive how the balance works out. And that brings us to the three outside actors. Russia does have troops on the ground, and there's a great deal of, for all the talk of soft power, hard power matters, but the reality is that the Russian troops in Karabakh are not in the same position they would have been in had they gone in 1994. Azerbaijan has leverage against them in terms of access that's just too important to be ignored. And second, Russia is no longer the only outside player that matters. Turkey is there too. It has been pointed out routinely in Azerbaijan that if Baku can agree to having Russian troops on its territory, and that's how Azerbaijan sees Karabakh, then it can agree to have Turkish troops on its territory as well. That hasn't happened yet in large numbers, but it will happen. It will happen, and if Moscow tries to defer on the corridor across Zengezur from Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan, it will happen sooner rather than later. Again, the primary players are going to be the local decision makers, not the outsiders, who are not going to be able to dictate their will. They're going to have to live within the constraints that are created by the facts on the ground, created by the local governments and the local populations. It is critically important to understand. And Iran is going to be a bigger player. I find it appalling that in discussions of the Karabakh dispute, and especially the last year, Iran has been ignored. It's almost as if there be dragons. We can't even talk about it. But Iran has a very, very big interest in not only the question of Turkish influence and Azerbaijan's increasing Turkification, if you will, de-Nakhichevanization, but increasing Turkification. That, from the point of view of Iran, is a disaster. And Iran is quite capable of taking some actions of its own. But it is not the failure of the West to be involved has been a failure that was rooted in the way in which the demise of the USSR was dealt with. There was no willingness to recognize that the borders that the Soviets drew were in many cases illegitimate and were designed to create conflict. There was no willingness to talk about those borders in 1991 or 92. There was no willingness to recognize that we were talking about a messy situation that was going to be messy. And instead, we stuck our heads in the ground, proclaimed that nothing must ever change, that the borders that Stalin, I've sometimes have written that we act as if we're the last defenders of Stalin's borders and the last defenders of Stalin's nationality policy in a number of cases. And we've done that because the assumption is that will be easier for us to live with. That has first led us to inaction, and second, it has led to a conceptual failure that we don't understand that in this part of the world, people we thought were objects and pawns of outside forces are in fact the dominant players today, and they're going to be more dominant. And we're going to discover, I think, when the archives are finally opened, as people like to say in my...
Paul, you unmuted yourself. You muted yourself.
I'm sorry.
There.
When the archives are finally open, people are going to see that Moscow did not see 2020 as a great victory for itself, but rather as the best of a bad job it could make in achieving a defensive position, as its relative standing in the region has declined as well. And I think that's going to be true of most of the outside actors, and possibly all of them, that what we are going to see in the future is a region that's going to be dominated by the countries in it rather than by outside players.
Thank you, Paul, for connecting all these dots in such a broad perspective, and for the lesson learned that we should be focusing more on the issue of actually empowerment of regional countries participating in this conflict and in regional dynamics, rather than just the strategic competition of outside regional players. I'd love to go back to kind of lessons learned in looking on the ground in terms of the corridor. But before we do that, let me turn to Bob with kind of a three questions from the military perspective, also drawing in some of the questions we're getting from our participants. Thank you. The first is looking at right now at the situation. We've had some truce breaks. So what does that mean militarily from your perspective? Does it have serious implications or not? The second is looking at the efforts also from a Georgian perspective. You're in Tbilisi right now, as you mentioned, at demining. What does that mean from a military, but also from a strategic perspective for the region and for normalization in the region? And then finally, a question from our audience, if you can comment on the role of mercenaries in the conflict, and if that is a useful lesson learned from the conflict for the region.
Sure, I'll take each of those in turn. At first, I did want to sort of piggyback on something Paul said about it's not only great powers intervening in regions and destabilizing them. The other side of that coin is that, as you said, Paul, small powers have agency, and not only do they have agency, but there's the moral hazard problem where a small power that believes it has a great power patron is likely to engage in riskier behavior. We've seen this all the way back. I sound like Cliff from Cheers here, but Corinth and Corcyra in the Peloponnesian War, dragging Athens and Sparta into a war. So we should not only be worried about or be attendant to or looking at how great powers intervene to destabilize a region, but we should also be looking at how the regional powers and small powers sort of instrumentalize that great power support in ways that can be destabilizing to the region and can cause problems for their great power patrons. So to the questions, the ceasefire breaks, you're right, there have been several. The worst of them have caused casualties and have lasted days, not hours. The 2,000 or so Russian peacekeepers on the ground are not sufficient to stop an escalation, but the sort of credibility of the Russian military, in that behind those 2,000 comes a lot more military power. So Russia's ability to stop an escalation is not based on the number of people it has on the ground. It's based on the belief that the Russian armed forces will intervene forcefully to stop an escalation. To this point, it's worked. But again, back to this, small powers with agency believing they have great power support. Right now, I think Armenia believes it's the aggrieved party. It doesn't. I think Azerbaijan feels that it has great power support. I don't think the Armenians at this point are relying on Russian support in the way that they may have been prior to the conflict, whereas the Azeris know that they have pretty strong Turkish support. So I actually don't see the ceasefire violations. These things happen in war. Often it's, what we call the strategic corporal, some soldier on the ground who makes a mistake or makes a split-second decision that causes an escalation, and then the commanders at higher and higher levels are trying to rein it back in. So I don't think these right now are a huge cause for concern, as long as both sides believe that the 2,000 Russian peacekeepers are backed up by a whole lot more Russian military power that they would bring to bear to stop an escalation. In terms of the demining, I'll be honest and say, I know this is an incredibly mined region. I don't have a lot of specifics on demining. I know that a lot of these corridor projects would be dependent upon a demining effort. The U.S. is actually, we're doing demining here in Georgia right now, still, from the effects of the wars of the early 90s. And so the demining problem in Nagorno-Karabakh and more generally in the Armenia-Azerbaijan war is going to be a decades-long problem. And any sort of transportation links are going to have to contend with the fact that this is a heavily mined area. On the mercenaries, so we know that the Turks sent some of their Syrian, the Syrian militia groups or mercenary groups that are backed by Turkey from Idlib province in northern Syria. We know some of them were moved into the conflict region. There were even reports that militias from as far away as Central Asia, Pakistan, were involved in the conflict. My sense is they weren't decisive. I think they were more than anything else an insurance policy in case things went badly, because the Azeris ended up not needing the much land power because they had done such an effective job of reducing the Armenian defenses prior to a ground attack with their precision artillery, with their drones, that they didn't need huge numbers of ground forces to win the war.
Thank you, Bob. Let me turn to Mamuka in terms of drawing a little bit back on the peace negotiations, and particularly with a focus on the 3+3 format. Basically, the questions are, can you talk us briefly through what this 3+3 negotiation format means for the regional powers, for particularly Georgia, that is increasingly perceiving itself as being squeezed between regional powers, and what does that mean? What does the format of 3+3 mean on the ground for economic development and potentially opening the corridor?
I'll try to be very brief. Definitely, this is a big issue, particularly for internal discussions in Georgia, when this initiative was voiced recently once again by Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Lavrov. It caused certain internal discussions. By the way, this platform first was born sort of in the minds of people after war in 2008, after Russian invasion into Georgia, when President Erdogan, concerned with Russian advances into Georgia, came up with this idea of pact for stability and cooperation for six countries involved in the region. These are three large powers, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, and three regional states, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. But after end of the war last year, President Erdogan proactively started to advocating, an Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs, previous one and the current one, during their several meetings with Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, voiced strong support to this initiative. My understanding is Azerbaijan is also supportive to this initiative, while Armenia is not very enthusiastic, but I think Armenia will be dragged in this, whether Armenia kind of can resist to that. I know that observers from Armenia are not very enthusiastic about this initiative. And then, of course, there's this Georgian kind of dilemma. Georgia wants to be part of European institutions, and Georgia is partly occupied by Russian troops. So it doesn't want to sit down and talk about some other things in this format without any participation of Georgia in the platforms like this, without Western presence perceived in Georgia as weakening of Georgia's position. So that's Georgian attitude to this issue. And if you think about that, there was two concerns there. There are 230 years of history of Georgian-Russian legal agreements, starting from 1783. None of those legal agreements were ever honored by Russia. And so entering some kind of platform of negotiations with Russia, agreeing something and which nobody knows whether they will be fulfilled or not, is not a very comfortable position for Georgia. Second thing is that 100 years ago, there was agreement between newly born republics, Russian Federation and Turkish republics, to work together to make sure that no Western powers are in the region. And that ended up very badly for sovereignty of three Caucasus states at that time, 100 years ago. There is a concern in Georgia, not only that this kind of arrangement now may end up with Western participation, may end up with if not the end of sovereignty, at least to this strict restriction of sovereignty of three Caucasus states. That's a point of view that is widely spread. My last point probably here is that on this issue, obviously, I'm not a part of Georgian government. My recommendation would be responding to this initiative. Russia has a choice, definitely. If it withdraws recognition of independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia as an independent states and takes troops out of Georgian territory, that opens space for conversation. If this are not done, which hypothetically will not be done, so there's not much for Georgia in this process. And by the way, an interesting detail, during all these discussions, whether it's by Russian observers or Russian politicians, there is no mention in this format 3+3 of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So are they political entities or not? What does it mean? It means, in my opinion, that even Russia doesn't recognize them as independent states. So I think it's at least some good news for Georgia in this process.
Thank you, Mamuka. We only have a few minutes left, but I do want to try to get in one more round of questions with a kind request of keeping it brief, so we fit more or less into the time that we have allocated. Paul, back to you and to the corridor itself. You recently wrote about how companies, especially in construction, are creating facts on the ground in Nagorno-Karabakh. Can you talk us very briefly through what that means in terms of the outcomes, looking at now a region that is out of conflict mostly, and into this complicated issue of corridors and the relationship, the physical relationship between countries in the region. What does it mean when countries are creating through private companies facts on the ground, such as they do now in Nagorno-Karabakh?
That's a big question, but let me be very, very quick. The first three points. First, let's remember we don't have any peace agreement. What we have are peace declarations, both in November and January. Those were declarations, they were not agreements. So we're not talking about a peace agreement, we're talking about declarative policies, which each party interprets in its own way. Second, the creation of facts on the ground is a diplomatic term that refers to any action that is designed to determine outcomes. And what we're seeing is that the governments and a number of corporations, both Russian, Turkish, and Iranian, are getting involved in building infrastructure and rebuilding housing in these areas. Some of that is working, disproportionately, that is working for Azerbaijan, which has its own money, a far greater amount of money to put in the game, and therefore attract more outside investment. You are seeing building of what was a scorched earth area in the so-called buffer zones is now coming back to life with this remarkable attempt to create green villages and a green economy. Some of that's PR, but there's a reality to it as well. And in Armenian areas behind Russian troops, what you see is a situation where there is some Russian money coming in, but it is far less than, it is several orders of magnitude less than what is going on the Azerbaijani side. So if you look out 6 months to a year, you're going to see an awful lot of infrastructure, a lot of new housing in the Azerbaijani section, and much less in the Armenian section. What does that mean? It means that as the talks go forward to give some concrete form to a new long-term ceasefire, at least, Azerbaijan is going to be in a better position precisely because of these facts on the ground.
Thank you. Bob, last question to you. Now, looking with a little bit more of a difficult question, looking into the future from a military perspective. We've seen that there's that over the last year conflict has subsided, but there are still chances that conflict can resume in a form or another, even if it is subdued. And with everything going on with regional powers, as well as between Azerbaijan and Armenia on the civilian side in Nagorno-Karabakh that Paul just drew upon, how do you assess, say, in the next year, the situation on the ground in terms of security? Looking at Nagorno-Karabakh and the larger region, what should we expect from your perspective for the next year from a security perspective?
There are multiple conflicts in the region, right? This is the one that just happened to reignite most recently, but they're all the two Georgian conflict regions of Abkhazia and Skinbali region of South Ossetia are still, so there's no military solution to that, but the things like Russian borderization in South Ossetia, moving border fences, kidnapping Georgian citizens, that's still ongoing. So that destabilizes Georgia. Yes, there's always the chance of military re-escalation in Nagorno-Karabakh if one or other of the belligerents decide that they're willing to risk a Russian intervention or killing Russian peacekeepers. There was the recent flare-up between Azerbaijan and Iran, which was also potentially destabilizing to the region. Of course, Iran has a large ethnic minority of Azeris concentrated in the northern part of the country along the border with Azerbaijan. So that's a potential destabilizing factor. And then there's always the potential that something could happen out on the Black Sea between NATO and Russia that could cause a destabilization of the region. So they're asking me to predict which one is most likely, some sort of escalation in Georgia by the Russians, an escalation in Nagorno-Karabakh, something between Azerbaijan and Iran, or something on the Black Sea between NATO and Russia. It's really hard to predict. I would only say there are multiple ways in which things could go badly wrong here with very little warning. Which is why Zbigniew Brzezinski, I think, called the Caucasus the Eurasian Balkans, right? I mean, it is a place that it's a little farther from Europe, but it is a place where it has always sort of produced more history than it can consume, and tends to export that history to other parts of the world. So I guess I'd just say we'll see. There are a lot of things that could go wrong, but things have been going since the ceasefire in Nagorno-Karabakh. Things have been going fairly quietly here. And let's hope it stays that way.
That's a lot of food for thought, actually, looking into the next year and the larger region. Mamuka, last word to you. Looking at Nagorno-Karabakh after the conflict, 1 year later, you have been focusing a lot in your work also on, much like Paul, on the economic side of things. So looking at that in terms of energy infrastructure and transport infrastructure, and the big discussions around corridors, including with regional powers more or less happy with the potential outcomes. We've talked a little bit about Iran. I wish we had time to talk a little bit more about that. But as a broad perspective, looking into economic development in Nagorno-Karabakh, what should we expect for the next years?
In general terms, just following up what Bob said earlier, I think large powers like Russia, Turkey, even Iran, and definitely Azerbaijan are not interested at this point in any escalation. And Armenia probably, under the circumstances, will not be able to have any escalation. So I don't expect in the short to medium run kind of perspective to have any major military escalation around Karabakh. I'm talking about next 3 to 5 years. That's on that subject. But on your question, I think as we well know, in terms of energy infrastructure, all major pipelines are in place. They are transshipping now oil from Caspian Sea into Mediterranean and European markets via pipelines crossing Georgia and Turkey from Azerbaijan. Natural gas pipeline was already flowing from Caspian Sea all the way to Italy, also through pipeline that crosses from Azerbaijan to Georgia and Turkey. So I don't expect any major energy infrastructure crossing from Azerbaijan via Armenia to Turkey. So if it happens, there needs to be major discovery in Caspian Sea at some point in the future, which will require new infrastructure development. It may happen, but it's not. We are not there yet. And then, in theory, that may be bargaining sort of chip for another kind of step towards settlement of the long-term settlement of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In terms of other means of transportation, I think this Baku-Black Sea connection will stay very active because it's beneficial for Caspian countries to trade with Europe through that connection. There's also railway that connects, functioning railway that connects Baku via Tbilisi to Kars. My personal view is that it's very, very essential for Azerbaijan for its internal economic development prospects and major, I would probably better say, stronger integration of Nakhichevan to mainland Azerbaijan to have this railway and highway connection between Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan. And by the way, you probably know that railway parameters and the maps are almost agreed. There's a discussion about highway. There's some resistance from Armenian side about highway, in general development of highway and where to develop it if it's developed. So these are parts of this peace negotiation and the broader kind of context and important parts of that. But my view is that there will be some probably flow of cargoes from Azerbaijan via Nakhichevan, maybe inside of Turkey as well. But that connection will not be dominant in terms of cargo movement between Central Asia and Black Sea and Mediterranean. It will be mostly flowing still through Georgia, but it doesn't mean that this is automatic. It has to be, that corridor needs to compete with other corridors, whether through Russia or Iran. So there needs to be more harmonization from that perspective between Azerbaijan, Georgia, Central Asian states, Black Sea countries, but that's a different subject of conversation.
Thank you, Mamuka. With that, unfortunately, we're coming to an end. I can only reiterate something that Paul made as a point before we started this conversation. We should have scheduled in 2 or 3 hours for this conversation. I know I have a lot of outstanding questions, and our participants have asked some big questions as well. Partially, we were able to address them, but partially not. So we'll think about a format in which we can reintegrate this conversation and some of these questions. But let me just say a big thank you to our distinguished panelists, Paul Goebel, Robert Hamilton, and Mamuka Tsereteli. Also a big thank you to our participants for listening to us and asking some very good questions. Also, finally, a thank you to MEI for putting this all together. I wish you a good rest of your day. Thank you again to everyone and hope to see you all soon.